I've seen many people anticipate a completely digital age here in the next decade or two. But really, how difficult is that to do? We'll be looking at gaming for this video, and the first major factor that I'll take into account is how many people are buying games in this modern age. I'll be looking at console gaming, of course, because that's the only kind where physical media is still looked at as standard. If you look at the sales stats, you tend to see quite a trend where digital sales are increasing and physical sales are decreasing. This has been definitely occurring in the past few years, but looking at those same statistics, the amount of physical sales is far too high for any company to just abandon it. Still, I think there's little doubt that if those trends continue like they have the past bunch of years, things will probably go to digital only after long enough. However, I don't think this trend will continue as strongly as it has, and the past 3 or 4 years have shown that. The statement is more opinionated and is speculation of the future, but I think sales will settle somewhat soon on numbers that are still too high to abandon physical buyers. Those are the statistics, and my opinion along with them. So the next thing I'll add are the whys. So let's start with why digital sales are increasing and physical sales are decreasing by showing the pros that contribute to digital game sales. I think the first one that most people look at regards convenience. Once you've downloaded the game, you can play it immediately with the benefits of not having to switch any discs or worrying about damaging the game. Not having to worry about damaging the game is also a big plus for those who don't take much care or for those who have kids. Another point of convenience comes from the fact that you can play the game immediately after release, and sometimes are able to download it before release, not having to worry about the time it takes for shipping or going to a store. Those are what I would consider to be the main pros of digital gaming, with the next few being more minor, in my opinion. You can get better performance out of a digital game than a physical one. This one is much less applicable due to the Xbox One and PS4 having mandatory installs to the hard drive anyway, making this an invalid point for the 8th generation, but it's still something you may notice on previous generations, with longer loading times and possible texture streaming issues with physical media. Game sales prices also tend to be a lot cheaper than even the used physical options. I've seen the Devil May Cry HD collection for $3, Thief for $5, and many more deals like that. They're unfortunately extremely unpredictable, but unless there's something that I'm missing, you generally don't get better deals than what's in the digital game sales. Those, I think most people would agree, are why digital games have been greatly rising in popularity in the past bunch of years. Now let's try to look at why physical sales are still high and have only been slightly declining the past few years instead of greatly like what we were seeing 6 or 7 years ago. The prices are generally more consistent and lower when planning to buy a game. I mean, sure, the lowest prices are generally the digital game sale prices, but if you're planning to buy a game new or used, it'll probably be cheaper to buy a physical copy from Amazon or GameStop than to buy something from an online retailer. There's more consistency to this being cheaper. As an example, Watch Dogs 2 is around $40 on Amazon now that it's been out for a while, although the price digitally is still $60. There was even a sale last month for the game, and it was still only on par with the Amazon physical price. As good as digital sales can be, they're just too inconsistent and unpredictable to be using as your primary method of purchasing games you're planning to buy. The games are also able to be played in used condition, meaning that you can purchase them for even cheaper if desired, or you can resell them yourself for a bit of money. You also don't have to worry as much about hard disk space. Like with one of the digital pros though, this isn't really applicable to the 8th generation due to mandatory installs. Instead, it only really applies to generations prior to this one on varying degrees. Moving on to pros that I think of as variable importance and depends largely on how the individual sees it. Once you purchase a physical copy of the game, you're always able to play it so long as the disc itself continues to work. Although this generally isn't a problem, it can be really reassuring knowing that you'll always have access to the game as long as your disc works. Non-multiplayer only games also of course work without having to worry about being online for DRM. Another thing you get with physical game is the physicality of it. This may be worthless to most and only valuable to a few, but you have to keep in mind that there are still many dedicated communities of people who collect games to have it physically. You can get physical items that you otherwise wouldn't have with its digital counterpart, whether that be the case art book, disc, or any other goodies that may have been left in it. I think that's most of why there are still very many people purchasing physical copies of games and why the numbers haven't changed much in the past few years. Now let's move on to the more subjective portion of this video, where I explain why I personally think physical media for games will still be around for quite a decent amount of time, even if digital sales continually gradually rise. This time, both pros and cons will be accounted for. Although the amount of people collecting physical copies may be small overall, I do think there are enough to make it silly for companies to abandon them. The only way to go digital only is to see that amount shrink, and I think there are still too many retro gamers who like physical copies to make the move a viable option. Even if you don't collect though, I think there are a lot of people who may appreciate the small things, like the art and reversible covers. Another issue is that of hard drive space. Yes, the 8th generation consoles have mandatory installations, but we've seen how much space physical discs can save up when you don't install them on the previous generations of consoles. I think CDs and DVDs are mostly what kept games in that 2 to 6 gigabyte range for over a decade and a half, but now we're seeing games increase in file size at a very rapid pace. Assuming this keeps up, discs may end up being a more viable option than bigger hard drives depending on how prices go. That's not really something we can predict just yet, but when you consider a user's internet speed or possible caps they may have, you can start to see why discs may end up being preferable here. You can also do nearly everything offline with a disc, assuming you're not trying to access the online multiplayer of the game, of course. You can go out and buy a physical game, put it in your system, and play it without issues. There are rare exceptions, and you won't be able to patch your game without some form of internet access, but you'll at least be able to play your game. If you're going digital, on the other hand, internet access is obviously mandatory to download the game in the first place. If you have a digital-only console, every time you go offline, it's essentially the same thing as saying, well, now I can only play the games that I already have downloaded, and that's it. I know this occurrence seems rare to have for a long period of time, but it's still something you just don't have to worry about at all with a physical disc. Disk space is continuing to grow. We're able to stack multiple layers on Blu-ray discs, and see a future where they'll still be able to hold 200 gigabytes, and possibly even higher when the time comes. I'm mentioning this as a point because it shows that we don't need to move to digital for space just yet. We may eventually, but that'll be a while. Even when Blu-rays are done, who's to say there won't be some disc that can hold even more? That's what happened when transitioning from CDs to DVDs, and from DVDs to Blu-ray. In terms of disc space, we'll be fine for quite a while, and that's assuming we don't revert back to the days of using multiple discs for a game as the norm. In my opinion, there are just too many pros of physical media and too many cons of digital media to make physical media obsolete. If physical eventually becomes a thing of the past, I think it'll only be replaced by being obsolete. When you look at cartridges, CDs, DVDs in gaming, each transition period had almost nothing but positives, with the only negative, at least that I can think of, being durability when going from cartridges to discs. In order to make physical media altogether obsolete, you need to have a solution in digital media for filling up hard drives too quickly, internet speed and caps being of no or little concern, more offline capabilities, which may not even be possible, lower digital pricing off of standard retailers, being able to sell or let your friends play your digital copy, and have less of a threat to servers being cut offline. Or at least, that's my opinion. These still need solutions that we just don't have yet, and that's assuming there are only few people who want to collect or have a physical copy for the sake of it being physical. So, in my opinion, we're still nowhere near going digital only. In fact, I sometimes wonder, could digital media become a thing of the past eventually? There are still a few things I haven't mentioned that may or may not become relevant in the coming years. An interesting thing to note is that the future of digital media is also uncertain. Many people are looking to a digital-only age, but there's also a possibility of its future looking worse than we anticipate. Although so far we've only seen a small amount of this, it is possible for a game or demo to be taken offline, only being accessed by the few who have downloaded it and never deleted it. It's also theoretically possible for a publisher to lock access to a game if you're connected online, or even offline. Knowing that you only own a license to a game and not the game itself can be scary. Although some of this is applicable to physical games, usually going offline can avoid DRMs like this for a physical copy. Another unfortunate thing is that eventually, services and products eventually become unsupported. Even if you own a game digitally, there's a very real possibility that in the future, when the console services it provides become unsupported, you may never be able to download your games after a certain point. It may become unsupported because it's no longer worth supporting in the company's perspective, or maybe the company itself has shut down. Either way, there could be a time where Xbox Live, PlayStation Network, Steam, and more could be abandoned, and you would never be able to download your games from there after a certain point in time. I'm not saying that this possibility should prevent you from buying games digitally, but it's another thing you don't have to worry about with physical games. With all that said, in the end, which is better? I think the answer to this is pretty clear, but not decisive towards one or the other. Or in other words, it depends. It depends on how much you want a physical copy, how much space you have on your hard drive, which console or platform you have, how much certain things bother you like having less hard drive performance or no physical items, whether you want to plan cautiously for the future, etc. There are just too many variables still for one to be clear as an answer over the other, and unlike many opinions I've personally heard, I think it'll continue to be that way for quite some time. But that's just my opinion. What do you think? Until next time, have fun.